This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good to see a reasonable turnout. I know we're moving towards Christmas festivities now. Talking of Santa,
Sorry.
Good evening.
Yeah.
But we've got Merilyn Moos, who comes regularly to these seminars, I'm delighted to say. Her example is one to be followed. But she's here to speak particularly about her new book, Beaten But Not Defeated, which I've read every last word of. I've had a good look through it. I'm writing a review of it in due course. It's a very interesting book, and we'll wait with interest what Merilyn wants to say about it, and after this there'll be the usual time for discussion and questions. So, Merilyn, over to you.
Okay, I mean, this talk actually had quite a few different titles in its genesis, and the title that I thought I was talking to today is Siegfried Moos, A Lost Revolutionary, and that was partly because I wanted to focus more on his time in Britain, but I am also going to talk about, inevitably, his time in Germany. Okay, and I'm also going to keep on drinking Keith's water. For all the official British fanfares over World War II, one group who are rarely mentioned are the anti-Nazis, who fled Germany between 1933 and the beginning of 1938, and who then settled in Britain. Ziki, my father, belongs to an even rarer group, people who had been members of the KPD, German Communist Party, actively opposed Nazism before the Nazis took power and fled soon after their takeover in January 1933. Most of the refugees who were admitted to Britain came here after the 1938 pogrom, usually referred to as Kristallnacht, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Most were fleeing anti-Semitism rather than fleeing for political reasons, though these two factors cannot always be clearly separated. It is unlikely more than a few hundred communist refugees arrived in Britain up till 1938. And my suspicion is that it was actually less than 100. We are not talking about a large number of people here. The immigration authorities had no category for would-be refugees politics, so all figures are, in fact, highly unreliable. The total number of all refugees who had arrived in the UK before Kristallnacht in 1938 was only about 10,000, compared to somewhere between 50 and 80,000 refugees by the beginning of the war. So the early anti-Nazi exiles are too often made invisible by this later and far larger exodus. There are other reasons why the anti-Nazi refugees have not had much attention in Britain. Prohibited from political activity as a condition of remaining here, they often tried to stay invisible. Moreover, Germans, who vastly outnumbered all the other refugees from the invaded countries, were the enemy, even if they were the good Germans. Long after the war had ended, if my parents were asked where they came from, they said Switzerland. Very confusing for me, actually, but never mind. Actually, they came from Germany. There were other reasons the communist exiles kept silent. For what was there to be said? The ideals and organizations they had given their lives to had been defeated by a barbaric system, the antithesis of everything they had stood for. Moreover, the Allies never honored the anti-Nazi revolutionaries, or indeed members of most resistance movements. From soon after the end of the war, the Cold War turned every communist a fellow traveller, especially if a refugee, into a potential traitor. MI5 was still feeding their notes on Lottie, Ziki's wife and my mother, to the CIA in the mid-1950s. The Klaus-Fuchs kerfuffle only intensified a suspicion of German communist refugees working for the Soviet Union. Finally, a belief in our side held an ideological influence over academia as well as politics, which only started to significantly reduce in the mid-60s, though there were some brave early swallows. There has, however, recently been a surge of interest in exiled German anti-Nazis. Lottie features in 4 books, which have come out in the last few years. Keeps me busy. But the interest in her is primarily a result of the present interest in spies and the spying activities of MI5, rather than an interest in the actual politics or lives of the refugees. Some refugees fleeing anti-Semitism are also receiving increasing attention, particularly the children who came over on the kinder transport. After all, what better emblem of the British state's generosity towards the refugees, concealing the greater reality of the tens of thousands of would-be refugees who applied to get into the UK who were refused. Louise London calculated only 1 in 10 adults who applied were given the right to enter the UK. What a figure. 2 researchers, Brinson and Dove, have looked at the lives of the communist refugees in the UK, but their main focus has been on the post-1938 cohort and primarily on the Communist Party's front organisations. But by 1938, as you will see, Ziki would not go anywhere near anything touched by the Communist Party. My father told me almost nothing of his political past. Indeed, the myth which was constructed, and which I had every reason to believe, was that he had never been a communist. After all, I remember as a young child celebrating Stalin's death. I remember their, to me, inexplicable misery at the suppression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, and though this is on the edge of my memory, at the suppression of the 1953 uprising in East Berlin. It came as a shock when about 8 years ago I finally got my hands on the MI5 files and started to appreciate quite how many untruths my parents had told me. My father was dead, and it was only in the last year of my mother's very long life that, faced with my now new certainties, she gave up denying Ziki had been a communist. I'm going to start by giving a bit more detail about why Ziki became a refugee before concentrating on his time in Britain. Louis, get a chair. Here, how come he did flee so early? And this, in fact, does overlap with my earlier talk here from a couple of years ago. Ziki was deeply involved in the anti-Nazi struggle, which I continued to believe was a product of his growing up in Bavaria. Without going into details, Ziki witnessed first the failed revolution of 1918-19, and then the rise both of the alt-right and, equally significant, the Social Democrats' tolerance of the growing Nazis. Moreover, Ziki knew Toller, I'm going to come back to that, a member of the USPD in Bavaria, who had led the revolutionary forces against the Freikorps in 1919, first to victory, then defeat. I can only conjecture, but do wonder whether the USPD's leadership in the strikes and their bravery during the Munich Soviet and its aftermath captured Ziki's youthful imagination. The USPD, before it amalgamated with the KPD, was the dominant left organization in Bavaria, and many of us here know how influential our first political experiences are. The USPD contained factions with inconsistent tendencies, some looking towards replacing the Social Democrats in the Reichstag, others far more concerned with building the USPD as a mass working class party, a tension which will reappear, I suggest, in Ziki's own politics. By the time Ziki moved to Berlin in 1928, he already understood that the Nazis combined an apparently socialist appeal to the unorganized working class, small tradespeople and small farmers with an appeal to big business, all lashed together with crude racism, a picture which has some unnerving similarities with UKIP. In Berlin, Ziki became involved in the Rote Kampfverbund, or Red Front. This was an organization originally established by the KPD as its military wing in case of civil war to take over power, but which after May 1st, 1929, had become essentially defensive. It was banned in 1929 after the May 1st demonstration called by the KPD had been fired upon by police under Social Democratic orders. From the late 1920s into the early years of Nazism, it was the Red Front rather than the KPD, at least in Berlin, which had been at the forefront of protecting local working class communities against the SA and frequent police attacks, under the police being under Social Democrat control. As my previous talk illustrated, the frequency and ferocity of these attacks has been largely, that's by the SA, has been largely ignored by historians, but it does contribute to explaining why the third period. The Social Democrats were then seen as social fascists, but this made sense to its working class supporters because of their experiences. The Red Front was based on small, locally recruited cells, mainly young and mainly not KPD, but its cadre was usually KPD, and that, I presume, was Ziki's role. It was unusual at an official level, both within the KPD and the Comintern, to prioritize as strongly as most commentators now think they should have the fight against Nazism over the fight against the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats were defined as the KPD's main enemy, seen as collaborators with the bourgeoisie, who would lead the working class astray. This third period position undermined the KPD's leadership's ability to understand the distinctive threat posed by the Nazis or to develop a coherent strategy against them. Indeed, the KPD regularly considered winding up the Red Front, but it was so well entrenched in working class localities that the Central Committee always backed off. In passing, an argument presented by Laporte, some of us heard him at Historical Materialism, is that the effect of implementing the third period line was to further distance the Central Committee from its local cadres. This line was applied unevenly. In Saxony, unusually, it was the left Social Democrats who dominated the pre-1933 anti-Nazi struggle, with the KPD members taking their lead from them. The Central Committee of the KPD by the early 1930s had become, he says, but I quite agree, had become too bureaucratized to learn from their members' experiences. What does this remind me of? Especially if as far away from the center as Bavaria. The consistency of Ziki's anti-Nazi activities reveals somebody who was not quite online. The Gestapo papers obtained from the Bundesarchiv also give Ziki's involvement in the Freidenker or Freethinkers as additional reasons for the removal of his citizenship because of his improper conduct. It has not proved possible to distinguish between the Freidenker and the proletarian Freidenker. Ziki, the Gestapo papers tell us, was on the executive committee of the proletarian freethinkers, who in Berlin anyway were probably the KPD third period breakaway from the main social democratically dominated body. Supposedly a humanist organization campaigning for abortion rights, rights to cremation, and so on, the freethinkers were also banned in 1932. This was under the emergency laws of 1932 against paramilitary organizations, which the freethinkers really would not appear to be. The suspicion has to be that at least the proletarian freethinkers were seen as, and probably were, a front for anti-fascist activity. According to one of the centenarians I interviewed a couple of years ago, there was a link between the freethinkers and the sports clubs or Fichte. There had already been a deep division in the sporting world between the Social Democrats and the Communists. Seems extraordinary to us, which the start of the third period intensified. Sports clubs were divided between the Social Democrats and the KPD-controlled clubs. Social Democrat clubs were far more hierarchical, but they were also better equipped. It seems likely that the KPD-dominated sports clubs were training people to fight the enemy as much as to stay fit. But sporting activities did not take place in a vacuum. I was startled when I discovered quite recently that my father wrote the lyrics, sector music by Volpe, for the Sports Review of 1932, a mass sports rally to campaign for Tailman as president, attended by 4,000 people. Imagine. I mean, we would be over the moon. Ziki was also deeply involved in agitprop, and I have to thank Ian for translating his published articles from the early 1930s, which are included in the book. Ziki was at least briefly the editor of the rank and file paper for Workers in Theatre and Cinema, another KPD front, as well as apparently running one of the many agitprop groups which played in working class halls, courtyards and community centres. Ian will know better than me, but Ziki's line appears to have been that the social democratic troops went too much into providing amusement, that the old communist line was too keen on the creation of caricature, cigars, top hats and so on, and that what had to be done was to provide realistic scenes which working class audience could identify with and which encouraged a way forward. Noticeable in Ziki's writings, as Ian pointed out, is the absence of the language of social fascism, another indication that Ziki was not quite online. Ziki in his person represented the varied but overlapping spheres of cultural and sporting influence of the KPD in the early 1930s in the working class or civil society, unlike anything we have ever experienced here. Given the disappearance of the KPD minutes, it is impossible to establish Ziki's role within the organization itself, but it seems likely he held a leading position within the Berlin apparatus and quite possibly was a paid officer. Ziki went underground during the night of the Reichstag fire on the 28th of February 1933, just before the Gestapo came knocking and then or soon after arresting Lottie. She was all right. Thousands of communist cadres were picked up that night. Thousands of communist cadres, especially of a middle-ranking level, leaving the KPD in a state of disorganization. The KPD, having failed to anticipate the Nazi takeover, had also not prepared for underground work. As many of us know already, many leading members of the Central Committee saw Nazism as a brief prelude to their taking over power. It is impossible to know what Ziki survived on during the 6 months he walked his long and dangerous walk out of Germany. Maybe he'd be instructed to try to build up a clandestine network. Maybe Ziki was following instructions in his final route out via Saarland, at that time under a League of Nations protectorate, and then to Paris, the two places at the time where the exiled KPD had centres where they printed material to be secreted back into Germany. I'm now going to skip to 1934, after Ziki arrives in Britain in February, 1 year after going underground. Ziki was unusual in ending up in the UK. Certainly most German political refugees, why is there a blank sheet of paper? That's all right, panic not. Certainly most German political refugees did not aim for the UK. By 1936, 930 had arrived, you can tell what state I'm in, 9,000 had arrived in France, and another 5,000 went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Although the exact number is not known, between about 2,000 and 4,000 German communists escaped to the USSR, many never to be seen again. As late as 1940, according to Reiter, only 5,000 German political refugees of all forms, in other words, everybody, had arrived in Britain, and many of them had come via France or from Spain. How Ziki got into the UK is itself interesting, especially to me. The immigration authorities were not well disposed towards German communists, and very few were admitted. Ziki was sponsored by Maxton and ILPMP. It was not proved possible to establish how this link occurred. Maxton, who was a leading member of the German Relief Committee, was one of the very few MPs who fiercely argued for the British government to admit the political refugees. Maybe the link was through the Indian Revolutionary and previously British Communist MP Saklatvala, whom Maxton knew through the League Against Imperialism. Ziki would probably have known Saklatvala through his negotiations about supplying Russian oil to India in the late 1930s. The link could have been Toller, whom Ziki knew from his Bavarian days. According to Pennebaker, Toller, by then a well-respected playwright and also very active in the German Relief Committee in Britain, provided the link between the ILP and an illegal network of assistance for the German underground, as well as being the best propagandist in the UK for the plight of would-be refugees. Toller could easily have mentioned Ziki's plight to Maxton. Maybe it was Lottie, who already in Britain and herself in contact with the ILP, approached Maxton. She certainly was up to doing that. Although I have suggested that Ziki was not quite on the KPD line, in 1934 he became the secretary of the German KPD exile group, despite the government's prohibition against political involvement. And I'm now going to go into something which some of you will love, because it's all about the personnel which are around at this time. According to papers in the Bundesarchiv, Ziki was put in by us as group leader, the only active and willing comrade. You know, this is double-edged, really. This certainly suggests KPD leadership approval. MI5 files corroborate Ziki as a member of the exile group between 34 and 37. Ziki's earlier twists and turns were apparently seen as less significant than his organizing abilities, or maybe it was that the other members in the exile group were seen as even less reliable. Though the figures are inevitably contested, the Bundesarchiv list, gives 17 members of the group. In 1980s, notice the date, East German source Exil gives 12 communists who were given temporary right to stay in the UK in these early years up to 1938. In fact, by 1939 it had gone up to 400. Exile, part of a series of books on political exiles written under the aegis and ideological influence of the GDR, dismissively states that of the 12 German communists in Britain by 1938, most were from bourgeois Jewish backgrounds. Wonderful stuff. Yes. In the 1935 MI5 files, there is an anonymous letter listing 5 members of the KPD exile group as communist agents and agitators for the KPD, including Ziki Moos. Their names overlap with the Bundesarchiv list. The sources are known, but it reveals that one of this tiny exile group was giving MI5 information on the others. Isn't it wonderful? Indeed, it is now known that MI5, who were very interested in all communists, especially German ones, lent on some refugees to swap information for the right to stay. I want to briefly give a picture of some of the refugees in this tiny group, listed in the Bundesarchiv papers. Most were presented as unreliable. 4 or 5 were students. Others were unlikely to stay in London. Hans Eisler, for example, was a left-wing musician, an associate of Brecht and an acquaintance of Ziki's, who passed through London, the exile group, on his way to the US in 1938. Others were listed explicitly as unsuitable or to be excluded. Rosa Levinet was seen as associated with the right opposition and therefore suspect, and was seen by Lottie as poisonous, I just throw in. Lisa Cocker was seen as an unsuitable on the request of Paris. Don't know who Paris is. Schulenberg on the request of Klaus. Max Berger was to lose all his functions, that is, was to be removed, and was subject to a party investigation. And Gerhard Friedlander, the son of Ruth Fischer and Paul Friedlander, is noted as wanting to be involved, but under the influence of his mother and Maslow. That is politically unsound. This is amongst a group of 12 people, you know. Yeah. Another member, Gunther Reimann, was suspected of being anti-Stalin. He had, like Ziki, been involved in revolutionary theatre and then become an editor of the Rote Fahne, the most popular of the KPD papers. After the Reichstag fire, he worked underground, and usually with the German Social Democrats, my God, as well as the communists. He escaped the Gestapo by walking out of Germany. I mean, I know I've said this before, but I always find it interesting who has to walk out and who can catch a train or whatever, which is... Yeah, anyway. Like Ziki, Ryman went to Paris and then to London. The Home Office threatened Ryman with deportation in 1937 for indulging in political activities after they intercepted one of his letters. He was saved by the Quakers and departed for the US, where he became a well-known neoliberal economist. Edith Bone, some of you will have heard of Edith Bone, was a functionary of the British Communist Party and the theoretical link with the exile group, but the Comintern's position was that the exile group should avoid contact with the British Communist Party. In passing, both Ziki and Lottie knew Edith Bone on a personal basis, which will have increased MI5's interest in them. Lottie, explaining how this came about, told her MI5 interrogators that she used Edith Bone's bath because hers, shared with other tenants, was so dirty. And unknown to any of them, including MI5, Edith Bone was a spy master for, as well as a functionary of the Communist Party. Don't look at your watch. I'm not finished. Oh, good.
You've got ample time.
Good. Ernest.
Working for the Russians. When you say
Sending a
that.
quick text.
Is that what you mean?
Ernest will sort that out in the pub afterwards. Ernest Hermann Mayer, a musicologist, is an exception to the list of unsuitables, but his exact role is open to debate. His participation in the group outlasted Ziki's, and in one analysis by Lesker, writing in East Germany in the early 1980s, supplants Ziki in providing the political leadership, as well as being the contact person with Paris. The place Paris. This analysis is unusual. The person you generally seen as providing the political leadership for the London Exile Group, at least from the end of 1936, is Jürgen Kuczynski. Kuczynski had joined the KPD in 1930, working as the economics editor of the Rote-Fahne, and from 33 to 36 was part of the underground. Once in London, it is generally agreed he took over as secretary of the exile group, and he certainly travelled regularly between London and the external leadership of the KPD, which was then located in Paris. In his biography, Kuczynski dismisses the KPD exile group before he took over from Ziki in a matter of sentences as essentially a group of disorganized intellectuals, dilettantes, and student types. Significantly, he does not mention Ziki by name and suggests that he, Kuczynski, was the first secretary of the exile group from late in the 1936. Similarly, neither of the two lists of members from research which came out of East Germany in the early 1980s, one by Lesker, which is unpublished, and one by Exil, mention Ziki. These lists only marginally overlap with the Bundesarchiv lists, and judging by the names, it is likely they were drawn from a slightly later period. Maybe Ziki had already left, but my suspicion is that Ziki had been vanished because of his subsequent betrayal of the KPD. I'm almost convinced that's the case. How far Ziki jumped, how far he was pushed, is open to debate. Although, as many of us know, issues of whether one resigns or is expelled can matter much. It is not possible to be certain what the exact purpose of the exile group was or how it developed. Any political activity could result in deportation, and I doubt there were many minutes kept. It seems that in its earlier days, under Ziki, they saw their purpose as to be in touch with British journalists, though on an individual basis, and to draw in new anti-fascist émigrés. Kuczynski takes over the group at about the same time as the third period is finally discredited. His aims were more ambitious: to send propaganda into the German underground. Ian is translating some notes on how they wish to achieve this. as well as to propagandize in Britain. There was also a decision to publish their own newsletter to be sent to the press and government agencies, as well as the German émigré community under Ernest Hermann Mayer. Remarkably, Paul Robeson contributed £500. So Germany Today was born, edited by Ilse Mayer. One small irony is that British intelligence, who wished to destabilize Nazi Germany by building up an internal opposition, could have made use of some members, I'm sure, in the KPD exile group with their contacts in Germany. But I mean, of course, they instead pushed them into a political shadowland. Both Mersenne and Palmier give a sense of the debates going on in KPD émigré circles around 1934, though neither refers specifically to the London group. Merton argues that the third period line was fizzling out after the decision by the KPD Central Committee in July 34, but a majority of the Politburo still supported an ultra-leftist position. The moves for Volksfront, People's Front, were strongest in Paris, although apparently the Paris KPD members' insistence on the liquidation of Trotskyists had a disturbing effect. It is only in October 1935 at the KPD's Brussels conference, Palmier argues that there is a clear call for united actions with other socialist parties, later endorsed by the Paris Commission. But the exiled Social Democrats officially refused to collaborate, though a few on the left of the Social Democrats did do so. Even the exiled SAP comrades resisted working with the KPD exiles because they were critical of the new position of a popular rather than united front and the collaboration with the bourgeoisie this would imply. They'd be so lucky. In Britain, similarly, the Social Democratic exiles refused to collaborate with members of the KPD, the one exception being Neue Beginnen. Originally established in Germany as a splinter group of the Social Democrats, they were willing to work alongside the KPD comrades, but there were very few of them, and the grouplet was in a state of internal disorganization. But by the time these attempts at alliances were playing out, Ziki had anyway left. The disintegration of third period policies also, it appears, had implications for membership. According to Lottie, during her interrogation in Holloway Prison in 1940, from 1936 the group had become looser, with a near party established for non-party sympathizers. Many of the group were ex-members, because they had not been given permission from the party before leaving Germany and had therefore been expelled. She was dismissive of the whole venture, but given she is responding to an interrogation in prison, she would, wouldn't she? Why did Ziki leave the exile group? In other words, why did Ziki leave the Communist Party? Lottie explains the reason why she and Ziki left. Although Lottie always denied to me she had ever belonged to any Communist Party, she told MI5 during her interrogation in 1940 that she left the KPD in 1937. In late 1936, Lottie had in effect escaped from Moscow, where she had been with Brian and where she had witnessed the beginnings of the trials. Brian was most probably her lover and also turned out to be a spy for the USSR. But the Russian secret police thought Brian was a Trotskyist to a significant degree because of his association with Lottie. Lottie gives one reason for leaving as Brian's disappearance. Unknown to her, he had been sent to the Gulag, where he died. Her other reason for leaving was the shooting of members of the POUM by Stalinist forces in Barcelona. She states these were also Ziki's reasons for leaving, building on, I suggest, his earlier misgivings about the line of the KPD. Ziki's letters to Lottie, who was rarely in London, also suggest a deep sense of fear and futility. I have the letters because MI5 kept them. Very kind of them. This tiny world of exiled communists had good grounds to feel insecure and paranoid in the UK, Originally established in World War I, MI5's historic concerns were with German spies and communist agitators. MI5 received information directly about German communists from the Prussian secret police up till 1933 and almost certainly beyond. And there were joint discussions about whether German communists should be admitted to the UK. MI5 were intercepting all Ziki and Lottie's mail and other comrades too, and we now know watched members of the exile group such as Kaczynski and Edith Bone. In addition, we know one or two of the refugees did spy for the Germans. Claude Sykes, for example, as recently opened MI5 files confirm, was charged with penetrating German refugee circles in London. Again, although it was never proved, the deaths of Dora Fabian, a political activist and former member of the German Socialist Workers' Group, and Mathilde Wurm, an ex-SPD member of the Reichstag, were understood by most on the left as murder. Ziki's sense of paranoia was well-founded. Ziki's sense of insecurity was also increased by having to constantly reapply for permission to stay, often as frequently as every 3 months. Each reapplication had to be cleared by both the Home Office and MI5. These extensions were far from automatic. The Home Office also refused Ziki a work permit when he obtained a job to work for the New York Times. From 1936, Ziki's situation was even more critical. Herman, the man he saw as his father, who had been able to send him regular small quantities of money from Germany, was now banned from doing so. Ziki wrote to Herman that he expected he would have to leave the UK. Oh dear, 36. Ziki disappears from active political involvement after 1937. Ziki's life must have felt as if it were falling apart. He had lost his belief in the revolutionary leadership of the Communist Party and lost his past comrades. And the wife whom he adored had gone off to the USSR with another man. Although, unlike Brian, she had got out of Russia, possibly in part due to Ziki's pressure, she did not move back in with Ziki. Indeed, Lottie was soon off again, travelling to France, I suspect, to see if she could find any trace of Brian, who had been sent as a radio engineer to Spain before being kidnapped and disappeared. He literally was kidnapped, by the way. He was kidnapped on a boat. Then, soon after her return to Britain, Lottie set off again to America without it being clear whether she intended to return. Without the support of comradeship, disillusioned by the Communist Party, which had inspired him, lacking any family, and without any regular source of income, I strongly suspect Ziki was at times suicidal. What is also worth noting is an absence. As far as I know, Ziki showed no interest in the tiny grouplets of other left exiles in London, including a handful from the SAP, of whom Dora Fabian had been a member, who in around 1940 were to join up with the exiled Social Democrats. The SAP, although they had originally broken from the Social Democrats in Germany in 1931, in exile were closer to the Trotskyists, and I imagine both these features must have put off Ziki. It is the next period that Ziki seems to shift into left reformism. Somehow or other, Ziki got a job at the Institute of Statistics attached to Oxford University. While I know my father was good at figures, he had never finished his degree in Munich, and I suspect some political strings must have been pulled. The Institute by 1938 became a magnet for left-leaning, even Marxist refugee economists such as Kalecki, though left Keynesianism was dominant. He also met or worked for Balog Beveridge and Harold Wilson. Ziki produced or collaborated on a large number of very detailed analyses of the state of the British economy, producing reports which were considered crucial in wartime. During this period, Ziki also wrote extensive papers on French post-war requirements for the Free French and economic analysis for a British government-sponsored, essentially anti-communist paper for German exiles, Die Zeitung. Like most other refugees, he was interned in 1940, telling me a story about when the officers at the camp in the Scottish Highlands discovered who he was. He was made, I don't know who he was, because he just said to me who I was. He was made to sit at the high table for meals with people he saw as his class enemy. Anyway, this revolutionary from a few years earlier had turned himself into somebody so important to the war effort that he was one of a handful to be almost instantly released after he was interned in 1940. Yet at the same time he was writing a number of articles and books about the nature of socialism. The articles bear no resemblance to the neo-Keynesian economic work he is being paid for, and is an early sign of his dual-track approach to revolutionary change. Zeke's articles try to suggest a new basis for socialism, but they actually fall between a search for ethical socialism and a rather economistic interpretation of Marxism. He also corresponds with a number of people who are non-aligned, such as Wintringham, but shows no desire to actively support him. Wintringham's appeal, I imagine, was that he was one of the leading non-Trotskyist ex-CP figures on the left. In the letters between Zeke and Orwell, Zeke expresses the fear that the world might be divided between a number of quasi-authoritarian regimes. Orwell corrects him for his pessimism. That takes some doing. Indeed, at about the same time, Zeke's private articles written early in the war do not rule out some sort of peace deal between the British ruling class and the Nazis. The end of the war marked the time when both Zeke and Lottie try to find out who is alive. There is one set of letters with Harry Wilde in around 1947, which again reveal how conflicted Zeke still was. Like Zeke, Wilde had been a cultural activist in Berlin, including an adjunct prop and involved in journalism. Although Wilde had left the KPD in 1932, he seems to have worked on behalf of the Comintern after 1933 via Munzenberg. In Harry and Zeke's first exchange after the war, their letters express joy and amazement that they are still both alive. Harry had survived 9 camps, but they established that no other comrades that they knew of were. Harry invited Zeke to the Second International Youth Congress in 1948 in Munich. There appears to be no record of this congress, and it is not clear what it was supposed to be. We have a proposed schedule for a June Youth Congress from correspondence with Graham Greene. It emphasizes understanding rather than politics. Zeke was initially enthusiastic about the invitation and the idea of returning to Munich. Well, that sounds quite suitable.
Do continue.
Zeke suggested to Harry he spoke on the importance of ethics in economics, but nothing comes of it. Maybe these twilight months just before the division of Germany into East and West zones and the Berlin blockade from mid-1938 meant Wilde's initiative was timed out, but it seems that Zeke had anyway drawn back. Had Zeke momentarily thought he might be contributing to building a united post-Nazi socialist Germany, I mean, it's touching but terrible. Did he then draw back fearing the hand of the KPD? In his last letter to Wilde, Zeke's break with his political past is laid bare. He writes, "A whole world separates me from the line. I have lost more than an essential part of my past, but there is nothing to be done about it." Zeke was also to discover as the war came to an end that almost every member of his family had been murdered as Jews. Zeke's personal life as a child had been complicated. His father had deserted the family early on, and Zeke had moved between his seriously impoverished mother and his highly affluent Jewish assimilated aunt and her husband Herman, whose family ran the wine and vinegar business in Bavaria. This contrast of fortunes I credit with encouraging Zeke's youthful revolutionary idealism. Herman had stood by his wayward nephew when he fled, and the letters between them, some included in the biography, are heartbreaking. In 1944, Hermann died in Theresienstadt, as Ziki was to discover weeks before my birth. At the end of 1947, Ziki got a job at Durham University, marking the final break with his past and the beginning of 20 years in the cold. The move denotes his intention to stay in the UK. This distinguishes him from the majority of the German KPD exiles who went back to Germany. Some had already moved to the US. For Ziki and Lottie, there could be no return. West Germany had not been denazified. East Germany was Stalinist. There was nothing to go home to. In returning home, one of Ziki's many lyrical poems written years later, Ziki suggests, however, that Britain never did become a new home. Ziki's intention ceased to be to rethink the basis of socialism. Ziki appears to sustain himself politically by his evening teaching of WA classes to shipbuilders and miners, and by becoming the secretary or treasurer of the AUT branch, regularly running up, some of you heard me say this before, regularly running up against one of the officers of the Conservative Club, one Leo Blair. But this is a period whom he loathed. This is a period where there is no other evidence of political involvement. The conservatism of this small, church-dominated, hellish town, mixed with the icy ideological fingers of the Cold War, reinforced Ziki's fear of persecution and the need to cut himself off from his past. His withdrawal from a revolutionary way of thinking and his paranoia also showed up in the way he behaved towards me. Did I not realize, he ranted at me, that if I joined a political organization like C&D, I would be damaging both his and my future careers? I would forever ruin my chances of joining the civil service. As I could think of nothing I wanted to do less, this wasn't much of a threat, but he did frighten me. Ironically, when I joined IS a few years later, I felt it as an act of rebellion against my father, whom I knew would disapprove. When Richard appeared in my life, take a bow, him of the Internationale, both he and Lottie assumed that the only reason he could possibly want to go out with me was to spy on them. Who is he? True. Didn't do myself morale very much good, though. Who is he spying for? I remember hissing at my mother. This is true. The Americans or the Russians? Does it matter? She replied. They are all the same. Anyway. Yet even in his darkest hours, Ziki did not become apolitical or move rightward, as many of the ex-communists who did remain in the UK did. Indeed, in a somewhat contradictory and shifting fashion, I think Ziki retained an optimism of the spirit, continuing to see himself as a revolutionary, but having lost any idea as to how to achieve socialism. Ziki and Lottie's return to London in 1966 provided them with a more comradely environment. Ziki had got himself a job as an economic advisor to the Board of Trade under Howard Wilson. I imagine his friendship with either Balog or Wilson helped. Here is again an inconsistency. Ziki had never been tempted, that's putting it mildly, by membership of the Labour Party, given his awareness of what social democracy was like. But the Wilson government had a commitment to limit and control multinationals. Ziki contributed to a variety of anti-monopolization papers, something which allowed him to combine his criticisms of capitalism and his belief that the role of the state included intervention to prevent industrial injustice and monopolization. Yet a year earlier, in 1969, he had written an article marking 50 years after the failed Munich Revolution, unequivocally condemning Ebert and the betrayal of the Social Democrats. I mean, it absolutely wipes them off. Anyway, When the Conservatives were elected in 1970, Ziki, then 66, finally retired, though I doubt he had a choice. The slow thaw in the Cold War, the challenge to the power of the Soviet Union and first Czechoslovakia and later Poland, and the 1968 turbulence in Paris fed some long-concealed spring of hope and eased Ziki's paranoia. Ziki, in the last 15 years of his life, revisited the politics of his youth. Given his early strictures against political involvement, I was amazed to see him and Lottie turn out on anti-Vietnam War demos. I was. He brought solidarity in Labour worker and welcomed the reblossoming of the revolutionary left, which these organisations represented. But despite his consistent anti-Stalinism, Ziki was never able to make the leap into seeing the Soviet Union as state capitalist or even a degenerated worker state. Till the end, I believe, wishing that the original revolutionary goals would somehow be fulfilled. Ziki also finally returned to writing wonderful anti-capitalist lyrics, railing against, precisely, hold it up, thank you, railing against injustice with the Hackney Writers' Workshop run by Ken Walpole, and then with the Approach Tavern Group. A collection of his poetry was published posthumously, and the copies I've got are free. Principled to the last, in 1981, Ziki broke off all contact with David Versick, his oldest and almost only friend, who had run the prestigious National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Versick had accepted a CBE. Ziki did not believe in accepting honours. From then on, he would not even send Versick a Christmas card. In 1983, to my astonishment, he turned up to support a picket in support of members of NATVI who were being threatened with expulsion from the union in a case involving the racism of the union, the college and the police. In his last years, I think Ziki was able to remember and retrieve the person he felt he truly was. Of course, I am presenting him as his daughter, and as his daughter, he was often not an easy man. He may have been a revolutionary, but his ideas on child rearing were at best 19th century. My father told me almost nothing about what happened in Germany. He did this partly because he wanted me to be a nice English girl, in which I think he failed, partly because he could not face confronting his own past. I had a childhood without a history. This biography has been my attempt to reconstruct his and my own history. Thank you.